Why did it take a team of IRS accountants to finally bring down Al Capone? Because no murder charge would stick. Yet Chicago let a giant, unlabeled Picasso statue sit downtown for decades with nobody agreeing on what it was. Engineers once actually reversed an entire river just so the city would stop drinking its own sewage. There are still laws on the books about giving your dog whiskey. And no, a cow did not start the Great Chicago Fire. Welcome to 71 Dumbest Things About Chicago, where you decide what's real history and what's just legend. Subscribe now before we reveal the truth. 1. Chicago actually made it illegal to fly a kite downtown and nobody ever repealed it. Picture some guy in a suit chasing his kid's kite through the loop, dodging honking cabs while a cop watches and technically has every right to write him a ticket. Tourists have gotten side-eyed for it, locals just laugh it off, and City Hall never bothered updating the books. So somewhere in Illinois, law, a harmless kite, is treated like contraband. Chicagoans joke that the city fought a war against joy itself. It is exactly the kind of forgotten, dumb little rule that makes this city feel gloriously ridiculous. 2. In 1871, the Great Chicago Fire tore through the city, wiping out roughly a third of it in a single blaze, and to this day, nobody officially knows how it started. Legend blamed Mrs. O'Leary's cow kicking over a lantern, but investigators never proved it. Families lost everything overnight. Buildings that took decades to build vanished in hours, and the city had to basically start over from ashes. Chicagoans rebuilt bigger and taller, almost out of spite, birthing the skyscraper era. So the city's defining disaster has an unsolved mystery at its core, and Chicagoans still shrug and blame the cow anyway. 3. Chicago has sent more than 30 aldermen to prison for corruption since 1973, and that is not a typo. Picture a parade of men in suits walking into City Hall every year, only to walk out decades later in handcuffs. Bribes for zoning approvals, kickbacks for city contracts, and favors traded like baseball cards became so normal that federal prosecutors basically kept a standing office just for Chicago politicians. Locals stopped being shocked and started keeping score instead. Ask any Chicagoan about their aldermen, and they will laugh before answering. It became less a scandal and more a tradition nobody asked for. 4. Al Capone ran Chicago's most feared criminal empire for years, yet the law never actually pinned him for murder or bootlegging. Federal agents chased him through speakeasies, shootouts, and blood-soaked headlines, but every murder charge slipped through their fingers. In the end, the man they could not catch for violence got taken down for something almost comically boring. He failed to pay his taxes. That single overlooked detail ended the reign of America's most notorious gangster. Chicagoans still find it hilarious that the city's most dangerous man got outsmarted not by bullets or badges, but by an accountant. 5. At the 1893 World's Fair, Chicago wanted to outdo Paris and its brand new Eiffel Tower so badly that it built something the world had never seen. Engineer George Ferris pitched a massive rotating wheel that could lift fairgoers hundreds of feet into the sky. Skeptics called it an engineering fantasy destined to collapse under its own weight. Instead, it became the fair's biggest sensation, carrying thousands of thrilled and terrified visitors above the city skyline. Chicago essentially invented an entire amusement park attraction just to win a bragging rights contest with France. Every Ferris wheel since owes its existence to that rivalry. 6. In 1945, a tavern owner tried bringing his pet goat into a World Series game at Wrigley Field, and stadium staff physically kicked them both out. Furious, he reportedly cursed the Cubs, declaring they would never win another championship. Fans laughed it off at first until years kept passing without a title. Seasons turned into decades, and the so-called curse became a genuine cultural obsession haunting the franchise. 71 years crawled by before the Cubs finally broke through again. An entire city spent generations blaming a goat for their baseball misery, and honestly, at some point they started to believe it themselves. 7. Visitors wandering the 1893 World's Fair stumbled across one of the strangest exhibits imaginable: a full map of the United States built entirely out of pickles. Every state carefully carved and arranged using cured cucumbers, standing in for geography. Fairgoers stared in confused fascination, unsure whether to be impressed or concerned about the smell. It became an oddly beloved curiosity photographed and gossiped about across the fairgrounds. Nobody quite remembers why pickles were chosen over literally any other material. Chicago's fair was already dazzling the world with skyscrapers and Ferris wheels, yet somehow a briny vegetable map stole its own share of the spotlight. 8. Chicago's nickname Second City has nothing to do with population rankings, despite what most people assume. The label actually comes from a mocking magazine essay written in the 1950s that dismissed Chicago as culturally inferior to New York. Instead of getting offended, Chicagoans grabbed the insult and wore it like a badge of pride. A famous comedy theater even adopted the name, outright turning ridicule into legacy. What started as a put-down became a permanent part of the city's identity. Chicago essentially took someone else's insult, rewrote the punchline, and made it their own inside joke forever. 9. Somewhere buried deep in Chicago's municipal code, the old card game Faro is technically still illegal to play. Once wildly popular in saloons and backrooms across the city, Faro eventually got swept up in anti-gambling crackdowns generations ago. Nobody bothered removing the ban once the game faded from memory, so it just sits there frozen in legal limbo. Most Chicagoans have never even heard of Faro, let alone worried about breaking this law. It remains one of those forgotten rules quietly surviving on paper decade after decade, waiting for someone to accidentally deal a hand and technically become a criminal. 10. The Union stockyards once made Chicago the beating industrial heart of American meatpacking, handling an almost unbelievable volume of livestock every single day. Workers moved through the yards in brutal conditions, processing cattle and hogs on a scale the world had never witnessed before. Poet Carl Sandburg immortalized the operation, calling Chicago hog butcher for the world, in his famous poem capturing both the power and grit of the industry. The yards eventually closed, but their legacy shaped the city's identity for generations. Chicago quite literally built part of its reputation on the backs of an enormous meat processing empire. 11. Chicago's federal court district has convicted more public officials of corruption than any other in the entire country since 1976. And that statistic alone tells a wild story. Prosecutors built entire careers just chasing crooked aldermen, judges, and clerks who treated public office like a personal ATM. Bribes, zoning favors, and rigged contracts became so routine that federal agents practically had a revolving door installed at City Hall. Locals eventually stopped reacting with outrage and started reacting with dark humor instead. Chicago basically turned political corruption into an accidental spectator sport that outlasted mayors, governors, and even entire decades. 12. During the dazzling chaos of the 1893 World's Fair, a charming doctor named HH Holmes was quietly luring visitors into a hotel he built just blocks away. Behind its ordinary-looking walls hid trapdoors, gas chambers, and hidden passageways designed for one horrifying purpose. Guests checked in, seeking cheap lodging near the fair, and many never checked out again. Holmes became known as America's first documented serial killer, hiding his crimes behind polite smiles and fair-season crowds. While the world marveled at Ferris wheels and pickle maps just down the street, a genuine nightmare was unfolding in plain sight. 13. A frustrated vendor at the 1893 World's Fair kept struggling to sell plain sausages because customers had nothing to hold them with and burned their fingers trying. Desperate for a fix, he started wrapping the sausages inside soft bread rolls so people could eat on the move without the mess. Fairgoers loved the convenience, and word spread fast across the grounds. What began as a simple practical fix for sticky fingers quietly became one of America's most iconic foods. Chicago essentially gave the world the hot dog bun, not through grand invention, but through one vendor's very sausage-related frustration. 14. Perched high above Chicago's Board of Trade building sits a massive statue that has puzzled onlookers for generations because it has absolutely no facial features. The sculptor reportedly assumed the statue would sit so far above street level that nobody would ever be able to see its face clearly anyway. So instead of carving detailed features, he left it eerily blank. For decades, pedestrians below had no idea they were staring up at a literal faceless giant. Once people learned the reason, many found it hilarious that Chicago's financial heart is topped by a statue built entirely on assumed indifference. 15. Chicago's 1893 World's Fair created an entire temporary city known as the White City, packed with roughly 200 dazzling white buildings built purely for the event. Millions of visitors wandered through grand halls, fountains, and exhibits, believing they were witnessing permanent architectural marvels. In reality, most structures were never meant to last and were quietly dismantled once the fair ended. Fire and demolition erased nearly all of it within years, leaving barely 2 original buildings still standing today. Chicago essentially built and erased an entire fantasy city almost overnight, leaving only fragments as proof it ever existed. 16. Long before gay rights became a mainstream national conversation, Chicago quietly hosted one of the very first organizations of its kind, founded back in 1924. It operated cautiously and briefly given the intense hostility and legal danger of the era. Members faced real risk simply for organizing, let alone speaking publicly about their cause. The group did not survive long, but its existence marked a genuinely groundbreaking moment in American history, decades ahead of its time. Most people never learn this piece of Chicago's past in school, yet it quietly places the city at the very start of a much larger movement. 17. Somewhere buried in Chicago's city code sits a surprisingly specific rule, making it illegal to misuse the imagery of the Chicago flag. That iconic flag with its 4 red stars is practically sacred to locals who tattoo it, wear it, and hang it everywhere from bars to bike shops. Businesses and artists have to be careful how they alter or reproduce it without technically breaking the law. Most Chicagoans have no idea this protection even exists until someone jokingly brings it up. It is a strange little legal quirk protecting a piece of civic pride most residents assumed was simply public property. 18. In 1903, a crowded Chicago theater marketed itself as completely fireproof, right before 602 people died inside it in under 15 minutes. Flames raced through decorations and exits jammed as panicked crowds tried desperately to escape a building that was never actually fireproof at all. It remains the deadliest single-building fire in American history, and it happened inside a theater built on false promises. The tragedy forced sweeping changes to fire codes and safety regulations across the entire country. Chicago's worst disaster became the grim reason theaters everywhere finally got exit signs, sprinklers, and real safety standards. 19. Ed Burke spent an astonishing 50 years inside Chicago's City Hall building, one of the longest political careers the city has ever seen. Colleagues came and went, scandals rose and fell, yet Burke remained a permanent fixture of local power for half a century straight. Eventually, federal investigators caught up with him, convicting him of racketeering after decades of alleged backroom dealing. His downfall felt almost mythical given how untouchable he had seemed for so long. Chicagoans watched a man who outlasted mayors, governors, and generations of scandal finally get taken down by the very system he mastered. 20. In 1918, Chicago police carried out a bizarre sweep, arresting over 100 waiters accused of poisoning customers who left bad tips. Rumors had spread that fed-up servers were spiking food or drinks as quiet revenge against cheapskates dining out around the city. Newspapers ran the story with equal parts alarm and amusement as diners suddenly grew nervous about their next restaurant visit. Whether every accusation held up or not, the panic itself became legendary. It remains one of the strangest true crime footnotes in Chicago history, proving even bad tipping once carried genuinely dangerous consequences. 21. In 1885, Chicago introduced the world to something entirely new, when the home insurance building opened standing at just 9 stories tall. That height seems tiny by today's standards, but back then it represented a genuine architectural revolution, using a steel frame instead of thick load-bearing walls. Engineers and skeptics alike watched nervously, wondering if the structure would even hold. It did, and it quietly launched an entirely new era of construction around the world. Chicago essentially gave humanity its first skyscraper, almost by accident, proving a 9-story building could change how every future city would be built. 22. In 1979, a Chicago radio promotion called Disco Demolition Night invited fans to bring disco records to a White Sox game to blow them up between innings. Thousands showed up, far more than organizers expected, and the explosion sent fans pouring onto the field in total chaos. What was meant to be a fun stunt spiraled into a full-blown riot, with fires, fights, and a field completely unplayable. The team had no choice but to forfeit the game entirely. Chicago accidentally proved that mixing baseball dynamite and disco hatred in one stadium was never going to end quietly. 23. Downtown Chicago hides a genuinely strange secret beneath its feet, because Wacker Drive is not just one road, but two full stacked levels of roadway. Drivers on the upper level cruise past skyline views, while an entire second layer of traffic moves quietly underneath through a maze of tunnels. Most visitors have no idea the lower level even exists until they accidentally drive into it. Locals use it constantly to dodge surface traffic like a secret shortcut hiding in plain sight. Chicago essentially built an entire hidden highway system underground and somehow made it feel completely normal to residents. 24. Jane Addams spent her life fighting for the poor immigrants and working-class families crowded into Chicago's toughest neighborhoods through her settlement house Hull House. Her tireless activism for social reform, women's rights, and international peace eventually earned her something no American woman had ever received before. In 1931, she became the first American woman awarded the Nobel Peace Prize, recognizing decades of quiet, relentless work most politicians never bothered attempting. Chicago's gritty streets essentially produced one of the most influential humanitarian figures in American history. Her legacy still shapes social work programs practiced across the entire country today. 25. Buried inside Chicago's city code sits a bizarrely specific law making it illegal to possess something called a stink ball, essentially a smell bomb designed purely to gross people out. Nobody quite remembers the exact incident that inspired lawmakers to specifically outlaw stink balls instead of just banning general nuisances. Yet there it sits decades later, still technically enforceable against anyone caught carrying one. Most Chicagoans have never even heard the term, let alone worried about breaking this rule. It remains one of those wonderfully specific forgotten laws, proving City Hall was once very seriously concerned about deliberately bad smells. 26. In 1915, the SS Eastland rolled completely onto its side while still tied to the dock in the Chicago River, killing 844 passengers in water barely deep enough to stand in. Families dressed for a festive company outing suddenly found themselves trapped underwater just feet from shore in broad daylight downtown. Rescuers and bystanders desperately pulled survivors from the river as the tragedy unfolded practically on the sidewalk. It remains one of the deadliest disasters in Great Lakes history, yet most Americans have never even heard of it. Chicago's own river swallowed an entire ship in shockingly shallow water. 27. One Chicago alderman found a creative and deeply illegal way to fund his lifestyle by quietly siphoning money straight from his ward's charity fund. Instead of helping struggling families, the cash reportedly bankrolled personal gambling trips and flashy Mercedes accessories. Investigators eventually uncovered the scheme, exposing just how casually public trust had been treated like a personal bank account. Residents who actually needed that charity support were left wondering where their help had disappeared to. It became yet another entry in Chicago's long-running tradition of politicians treating public funds like their own private allowance. 28. On Valentine's Day in 1929, gunmen dressed as police officers lined up 7 members of a rival gang against a garage wall and opened fire in one of the most brutal massacres in American crime history. The killings shocked the entire country and were widely blamed on Al Capone's crime empire trying to eliminate competition. Despite intense investigations and national headlines, not a single person was ever officially convicted for the murders. The case remains legally unsolved to this day, despite everyone basically knowing who was responsible. Chicago's most infamous gangland massacre technically ended without a single guilty verdict ever being handed down. 29. The inventor of the Twinkie reportedly could not stay away from his own creation, eating 2 or 3 of them every single night for decades straight. Most people would assume that habit sounds like a fast track to health problems, yet the man lived to the impressive age of 88. Chicagoans and snack lovers everywhere found the story almost too perfect. Proof that maybe cream-filled sponge cake was not the villain everyone assumed. It became a strangely wholesome piece of food trivia passed around for generations. Sometimes the inventor really does become the product's most loyal, lifelong customer. 30. Chicago once made a baseball trade so lopsided that it still gets ranked among the worst decisions in the sport's entire history. The Cubs sent away a young outfielder named Lou Brock, who went on to become a Hall of Fame legend and one of the greatest base stealers baseball has ever seen. Meanwhile, the players Chicago received in return quickly faded into obscurity without leaving much of a legacy at all. Fans watched in disbelief as Brock's career exploded somewhere else entirely. Decades later, Chicagoans still bring up that trade as a painful cautionary tale about giving up on talent too early. 31. Deep beneath downtown Chicago sat a forgotten freight tunnel system built decades earlier and largely abandoned once trucks replaced underground rail carts. Nobody paid much attention to those old tunnels until a construction crew accidentally punctured one in 1992, letting the Chicago River pour straight into the network below the loop. Water flooded basements, electrical systems, and subway lines, causing an astonishing $2 billion in damage almost overnight. Businesses shut down, entire city blocks went dark, and confused workers evacuated buildings with no idea a century-old tunnel was to blame. Chicago essentially got flooded by its own forgotten infrastructure, hiding silently underground for generations. 32. During the chaos of Chicago's 1968 Democratic Convention, police clashed violently with protesters in scenes broadcast live to a horrified nation. A federal investigation later officially labeled the violence a police riot, confirming what protesters had claimed all along. Rather than reforming the department afterward, the mayor's response stunned observers when officers involved ended up receiving a pay raise instead of consequences. Critics called it an almost cartoonish reward for documented brutality. The convention became a defining symbol of 1960s unrest, and Chicago's unusual response only cemented its reputation for handling scandal in the strangest possible way. 33. Back in 1893, Chicago passed a municipal code capping building heights at just 130 feet, even though taller buildings were already standing proudly downtown at the time. Lawmakers apparently decided to regulate skyscraper height after the fact rather than before construction had already blown past their new limit. Architects and developers found themselves technically violating a rule that existed only because the city forgot to write it earlier. The contradiction became an odd footnote in a city that had just invented the skyscraper itself. Chicago somehow managed to outlaw its own architectural achievement the moment after proudly creating it. 34. Long before robot vacuums or fancy home gadgets, Chicago quietly gave the world one of its most useful household inventions when the vacuum cleaner was created there in 1868. Early versions were bulky, awkward machines requiring serious effort to operate compared to today's sleek models. Still, the basic idea of mechanically sucking dirt from floors instead of endlessly sweeping by hand changed domestic life forever. Homeowners everywhere eventually adopted some version of the concept without ever realizing its Chicago origins. It remains one of those overlooked inventions where the city changed everyday life worldwide without ever getting much credit for it. 35. One Chicago alderman decided the best way to clean up corruption was to become part of the investigation himself by secretly working as an FBI mole inside his own council. While colleagues traded favors and bribes behind closed doors, he quietly fed information to federal agents building cases against the very people he sat beside every week. The betrayal eventually helped convict several corrupt officials who never suspected their own colleague was wearing a wire. It remains one of the boldest insider moves in Chicago political history. Sometimes the mole in the room was the guy nobody ever expected to flip. 36. During Prohibition, Chicago transformed into a city practically built around breaking the very law meant to stop drinking entirely. Estimates suggest thousands of illegal speakeasies operated simultaneously, hidden behind bakeries, barbershops, and unmarked doors across every neighborhood. Bootleggers, gangsters, and everyday citizens all found creative ways to keep the alcohol flowing, despite federal agents constantly raiding suspected locations. The sheer scale of defiance made enforcement almost impossible no matter how many operations authorities shut down. Chicago essentially treated prohibition less like a serious law and more like an inconvenient suggestion the entire city collectively decided to ignore. 37. Most people assume the very first McDonald's opened somewhere in California, given the brand's West Coast origin story with the actual founding brothers. Yet the first true franchise location actually opened in a Chicago suburb built specifically as a copy of that original California stand. Ray Kroc pushed the idea nationwide from Illinois, turning one small burger stand concept into a global empire. The suburb location became the launching pad for what eventually grew into thousands of restaurants worldwide. Chicago essentially became ground zero for franchising fast food history, even though the original idea started somewhere else entirely. 38. In 1984, the White Sox and Brewers played a baseball game so long that it stretched an astonishing 25 innings before finally ending. What started as a normal evening matchup dragged on so late that the game actually had to be suspended overnight and finished the following day. Exhausted players. Fans and broadcasters watched history unfold in real time as the marathon shattered previous records. It remains the longest game in Major League Baseball history decades later. Chicago essentially hosted a baseball game so committed to not ending that it needed an entire extra day just to finish. 39. Standing atop Chicago's tallest skyscraper on a perfectly clear day offers visitors a view so massive it technically stretches across 4 entire states at once. Tourists ride elevators rocketing upward before stepping onto observation decks overlooking Illinois, Michigan, Indiana, and Wisconsin, all visible simultaneously in the distance. Skeptical visitors often assume the claim is exaggerated until they actually see the skyline blur into open horizon themselves. The sheer scale of the view has made the building one of the most visited attractions in the entire country. Chicago essentially built a skyscraper tall enough to let tourists sightsee 4 states from one single spot. 40. Illinois politics developed such a notorious reputation that the state has sent 4 different governors to prison over the years for various forms of corruption. One governor infamously tried to auction off a vacant United States Senate seat, treating a powerful government position like an item up for sale to the highest bidder. Investigators caught the scheme on wiretap, turning it into one of the most jaw-dropping political scandals in modern American history. The story became a national punchline almost overnight. Illinois essentially built a reputation where going to prison eventually became something Chicagoans mockingly expected from their own governors. 41. Chicago once had a law so aggressive that carrying less than a single dollar in your pocket could technically get a person arrested as a vagrant. Police used the rule to sweep up anyone they deemed suspicious, loitering around downtown streets regardless of whether they had actually broken any real law. Poor workers, travelers, and unlucky citizens alike found themselves detained simply for appearing broke in public. The rule reflected an era obsessed with controlling appearances rather than actual crime. Chicagoans today find it almost unbelievable that simply having empty pockets was once treated as a punishable offense downtown. 42. In 1930, Chicago opened the Adler Planetarium, becoming the very first planetarium ever built anywhere in the Western Hemisphere. Visitors stepped inside expecting a simple science exhibit, and instead found themselves staring up at a dazzling simulated night sky projected across the domed ceiling. Nothing like it had existed in America before making the experience feel almost magical to early crowds. It quickly became a beloved cultural landmark, inspiring future generations of astronomers and space enthusiasts. Chicago essentially gave America its first real glimpse of the stars indoors, decades before anyone had ever left the atmosphere. 43. Chicago's Operation Greylord Sting stands as one of the most jaw-dropping corruption investigations in American legal history, exposing 92 officials caught taking bribes across the justice system. Undercover agents posed as lawyers and defendants, feeding fake cases through courtrooms to catch judges, clerks, and attorneys accepting cash for favorable rulings. 17 sitting judges alone were caught in the scheme, stunning a public that assumed courtrooms were at least somewhat untouchable. The investigation forced sweeping reforms across Cook County's entire legal system. Chicago essentially proved that even its judges were not immune to the city's corruption reputation. 44. Throughout the 1920s, Chicago's gangland wars left behind an almost staggering number of unsolved killings, as rival crime organizations fought bloody turf battles across the city. Bodies turned up in alleys, garages, and back streets, while newspapers struggled to keep pace with the violence unfolding weekly. Police investigations frequently stalled thanks to intimidated witnesses, bribed officials, and gangs simply too powerful to touch. Most of these killings never resulted in a single arrest, let alone a conviction. Chicago's Prohibition era essentially became a graveyard of open cases proving organized crime operated with near total impunity for years. 45. By 1900, Chicago faced a genuinely disgusting problem because the city's sewage kept flowing directly into the same river supplying its drinking water. Engineers responded with an almost unbelievable solution by physically reversing the flow of the entire Chicago River, sending waste away from the city instead of back into it. The massive engineering project stunned other cities, watching in disbelief that reversing an entire river was even possible. It remains one of the most ambitious civil engineering feats in American history. Chicago essentially solved its own drinking water crisis by forcing an entire river to flow backward permanently. 46. Long before it became one of baseball's most beloved ballparks, Wrigley Field actually opened under a completely different name, entirely unrelated to the Cubs. It was originally called Weeman Park, after the businessman who built it for his own baseball team at the time. Ownership changes and rebranding eventually replaced the name, entirely erasing its original identity from most fans' memory. Today, millions of visitors walk past ivy-covered walls, having no idea the stadium once carried a completely different founder's name. Chicago's most iconic ballpark essentially started life under an identity almost nobody remembers anymore. 47. Historic Route 66 became one of America's most legendary roads, carrying travelers across the entire country toward the promise of the open West. What many people never realize is that this famous highway technically begins right in downtown Chicago rather than somewhere more remote or symbolic. Millions of road trippers have posed for photos at its starting marker without fully appreciating how urban its true origin point actually is. The route later inspired songs, movies, and an entire culture of American road tripping. Chicago essentially became the unexpected starting line for one of the most mythologized journeys in American history. 48. In 1960, Americans watched history unfold when the first televised presidential debate between Kennedy and Nixon broadcast live from a studio right in Chicago. Viewers at home saw a confident, telegenic Kennedy contrasted against a visibly nervous, sweating Nixon, and the visual difference reportedly swayed public opinion dramatically. Radio listeners, meanwhile, thought Nixon had actually won based on substance alone, completely unaware of how television had reshaped the entire narrative. The debate proved appearance could suddenly matter as much as policy in American politics. Chicago quietly became the birthplace of modern televised political theater, almost by accident. 49. In 2006, Chicago's City Council passed a citywide ban on foie gras, sparking immediate ridicule from restaurant owners, chefs, and even the city's own mayor. Frustrated by what he considered an absurd overreach, the mayor publicly called it the silliest law the council had ever passed. Restaurants quietly ignored the ban altogether, while enforcement proved nearly impossible against determined chefs smuggling the dish onto menus anyway. Public embarrassment mounted until the council eventually reversed the ban entirely just 2 years later. Chicago essentially banned a fancy appetizer, only to admit defeat once everyone realized how ridiculous enforcing it actually was. 50. More than a century after the Great Chicago Fire destroyed a third of the city, officials finally decided to address one lingering piece of unfinished business involving a cow. In 1997, Chicago's City Council formally exonerated Mrs. O'Leary's cow, clearing its name from the infamous legend, blaming it for starting the entire disaster. The largely symbolic gesture came a full 127 years after the fire itself occurred. Historians had long doubted the story anyway, yet the city still felt compelled to make it official. Chicago essentially issued a formal apology to a cow more than a century late. 51. Most people assume Chicago earned its Windy City nickname because of harsh lake gusts blowing off Lake Michigan year-round. In reality, Historians widely believe the phrase actually originated from journalists mocking long-winded, boastful Chicago politicians during the 19th century. These writers were poking fun at the endless bragging and hot air coming from local leaders rather than describing actual weather patterns. Over time, the insult stuck and eventually got reinterpreted by the public as a reference to literal wind instead. Chicago essentially inherited its most famous nickname from an old political insult that quietly changed meaning over generations. 52. Chicago's lakefront stretches across roughly 26 miles of shoreline, featuring 26 separate public beaches, all legally protected as public land for residents to enjoy freely. City planners fought hard generations ago to prevent private development from swallowing up the waterfront the way many other American cities allowed. Because of those protections, millions of Chicagoans and tourists can walk, swim, and relax along the lake without ever needing permission or paying admission. Few cities boast this much protected natural shoreline, sitting directly against a massive downtown skyline. Chicago essentially guaranteed its own beaches would belong to everyone, rather than a wealthy few forever. 53. Chicago's famous L train system gets its nickname simply because it originally stood for elevated, referring to tracks running high above city streets on raised platforms. Confusingly, however, large sections of the same system actually run completely underground through subway tunnels, contradicting the very name people use every day. Riders hopping on downtown often forget they are technically using an elevated train while sitting several stories below street level. Locals rarely question the inconsistency, having grown up simply calling it the L without thinking twice. Chicago essentially kept an outdated nickname alive even after half the system stopped matching its own description. 54. Every year, Chicago transforms its own river into a shockingly bright shade of green, using a closely guarded dye formula that the local plumbers union has never fully revealed to the public. Crowds gather along bridges downtown each year, specifically to watch the transformation happen live, turning an entire waterway into a temporary tourist spectacle. Rumors and guesses about the exact ingredients circulate constantly, yet the union guards its recipe like a sacred secret. Environmentalists have questioned the dye for decades while the tradition simply continues regardless. Chicago essentially turns an entire river into a mystery science experiment once a year for fun. 55. Buried inside Chicago's animal ordinances sits a bizarrely specific law making it illegal to give a dog whiskey no matter how casually the idea might come up. Nobody quite remembers the exact incident that inspired lawmakers to specifically legislate against boozy dogs rather than simply banning general animal mistreatment. Yet decades later, the rule remains technically enforceable against any owner caught pouring their pet a drink. Most Chicagoans have never heard of this law, let alone considered testing it. It remains one of those wonderfully oddly specific rules, proving City Hall once took drunk dogs very seriously indeed. 56. Despite feeling like a sprawling major metropolis, Chicago is remarkably flat, with its highest and lowest natural points differing by less than 100 feet of elevation across the entire city. Visitors expecting dramatic hills or valleys are often surprised to find the landscape almost perfectly level from downtown all the way to the outer neighborhoods. That flatness actually made construction planning and street grids significantly easier for early city builders centuries ago. It also explains why Chicago's skyline looks so dramatically vertical compared to its horizontal surroundings. Chicago essentially built one of America's most impressive skylines on top of remarkably unremarkable flat ground. 57. Chicago's red light traffic camera program was originally introduced to improve safety at dangerous intersections across the city, yet it eventually became the center of one of the largest municipal bribery scandals in modern American history. Investigators discovered city officials had been taking cash payments in exchange for expanding camera locations regardless of actual safety data. The scandal exposed years of manipulated placements designed to generate revenue rather than protect pedestrians. Public trust collapsed once residents realized tickets had been issued, partly to fund corruption rather than genuine safety concerns. Chicago essentially turned a safety program into another chapter of its own corruption legacy. 58. The organized crime network Al Capone helped build during Prohibition did not simply disappear once he was imprisoned for tax evasion decades ago. Historians believe some version of that criminal infrastructure continued operating in various forms for nearly a century afterward, long after Capone himself had faded from headlines. Successors quietly adapted the operation, shifting focus as laws and law enforcement strategies changed over time. The scale and endurance of the network surprised even seasoned investigators studying organized crime history. Chicago essentially gave birth to a criminal empire so deeply rooted that removing its founder barely slowed it down at all. 59. At a Chicago hotel, a wealthy socialite once requested a dessert. Elegant enough for a luncheon, yet practical enough to fit neatly inside a lunchbox without falling apart. Hotel chefs experimented until they created a dense, fudgy square that satisfied both requirements perfectly and quickly became a guest favorite. Word of the rich chocolatey treat spread fast, turning it into a permanent menu staple loved far beyond that one event. The dessert eventually became a household staple baked in kitchens across the entire country. Chicago essentially invented the brownie because one picky socialite refused to eat anything inconvenient at lunch. 60. Long before it became a nationally recognized competitive activity, baton twirling reportedly held its first official American competition right in Chicago back in 1935. Performers spun, tossed, and caught batons in front of curious crowds, unfamiliar with the sport as an organized event rather than a casual halftime display. The competition helped formalize rules and judging standards that later spread to schools and events across the entire country. What started as a niche local gathering eventually became a fixture of parades and marching bands nationwide. Chicago essentially launched an entire competitive tradition most Americans never realized had such specific origins. 61. When Batman's Gotham City needed gritty, realistic car chase scenes, filmmakers turned to Chicago's own streets and skyline for that perfect, brooding urban backdrop. Crews even redesigned Illinois license plates, specifically so they would blend seamlessly into the fictional Gotham setting without giving away the real filming location. Fans watching closely have since spotted these subtle plate details hidden in plain sight throughout several films. Locals still enjoy pointing out familiar Chicago streets disguised as the darkest city in comic book history. It turns out Gotham's grime and grit had a very real and very proud Midwestern hometown all along. 62. One Chicago debate reportedly ended so fast that it barely lasted a full sentence, let alone the hours audiences typically expect from formal political arguments. According to the story, one man simply stood up, said the affirmative rests, and instantly won without further discussion needed. Confused spectators barely had time to settle into their seats before the entire debate had already concluded. The moment became local legend, passed around for its sheer absurd brevity, compared to typical long-winded political theater. Sometimes the fastest way to win an argument in Chicago apparently involves saying almost nothing at all. 63. Buried inside Chicago's municipal code sits a peculiar rule barring street performers from putting on a show inside a storefront window if it happens to draw too large a crowd on the sidewalk outside. Lawmakers apparently worried more about pedestrian congestion than they did about supporting spontaneous public entertainment downtown. Performers eager to attract attention through creative window displays technically risk breaking the law simply by being too popular. Most Chicagoans have never encountered this rule directly, since it rarely gets enforced against modern street performers. It remains a strange little reminder that even entertaining people too well downtown once counted as a punishable offense. 64. A Chicago mayor's own patronage chief once ran a jobs for political loyalty scheme so blatant that it directly defied a specific court order designed to stop exactly that kind of favoritism. Instead of hiring based on qualifications, positions reportedly went to loyal supporters willing to campaign and vote the right way. Investigators eventually caught the scheme, proving the operation continued brazenly, even after a judge had explicitly banned it. The case became a striking example of Chicago political machines ignoring legal boundaries when convenient. Even a direct court order apparently was not enough to stop City Hall from playing favorites. 65. The Chicago Tribune Tower's exterior holds a genuinely strange secret because embedded directly into its stone walls are actual physical fragments taken from famous landmarks scattered across the entire world. Pieces reportedly include fragments from the Great Wall of China and the Parthenon, alongside dozens of other historic sites collected from around the globe. Visitors walking past rarely notice these tiny embedded relics unless someone specifically points them out at eye level. Newspaper correspondents originally gathered many of the pieces while traveling abroad on assignment decades ago. Somewhere downtown, Chicago quietly displays pieces of ancient world history, hiding in plain sight along an ordinary sidewalk. 66. In 1973, a Motorola engineer stood on an ordinary Chicago sidewalk and made history by placing the very first handheld cell phone call the world had ever seen. Passers-by had no idea they were witnessing the birth of a technology that would eventually reshape nearly every aspect of modern daily life. The bulky prototype phone looked nothing like today's sleek devices, yet it proved the concept could actually work outside a lab. Reporters and skeptics alike were stunned that wireless calling was even technically possible at the time. A single ordinary sidewalk in Chicago quietly became the exact spot where mobile phones officially began their journey. 67. Softball reportedly traces its origins back to Chicago, growing out of a heated argument between friends debating the results of a Harvard versus Yale football game. Frustrated energy from the disagreement apparently spilled into a makeshift indoor game using a rolled-up boxing glove and a broomstick as improvised equipment. What started as a spontaneous way to blow off steam eventually evolved into an organized sport with actual rules and official leagues. The casual invention spread far beyond Chicago, becoming a beloved pastime played in parks across the entire country. A simple sports argument accidentally gave America an entirely new game to obsess over. 68. Standing prominently in Daley Plaza sits a massive 50-foot Picasso sculpture that has confused Chicagoans since the moment it was unveiled, because it was never officially titled or explained by the artist himself. Residents debated for years what exactly the abstract structure was even supposed to represent without ever getting a clear answer. One alderman grew so frustrated with the mysterious artwork that he seriously proposed replacing it entirely with a statue honoring Cubs legend Ernie Banks instead. The proposal never succeeded, and the original sculpture remains standing exactly where it always has. Chicago's most famous public artwork still keeps its true meaning a permanent unsolved mystery. 69. Deep dish pizza first emerged from Pizzeria Uno right in Chicago, rather than being imported from Italy, as many visitors mistakenly assume when ordering their first slice. The thick, buttery crust piled high with cheese and chunky tomato sauce looked almost nothing like traditional thin Italian pizza. At the time it debuted, skeptics initially questioned whether the heavy dish even qualified as pizza at all, compared to familiar styles. Locals quickly embraced it anyway, turning it into a defining symbol of Chicago's food identity. What started as a bold local experiment eventually became one of America's most argued about pizza styles nationwide. 70. Cloudgate. The massive reflective sculpture nicknamed the Beam, sitting inside Millennium Park, was forged from one single continuous piece of stainless steel without a single visible seam anywhere across its entire curved surface. Engineers faced an enormous technical challenge, achieving such a flawless mirror-like finish on a structure that size using traditional fabrication methods. Visitors constantly pressed their hands against its surface, trying to spot even the faintest seam, only to come up empty every single time. The sculpture quickly became one of the most photographed landmarks in the entire country almost overnight. A single seamless steel beam somehow became Chicago's most unexpected tourist obsession. 71. At the height of his criminal empire during Prohibition, Al Capone's illegal alcohol business reportedly generated an almost unbelievable $60 million in profit during a single year alone back in 1927. That staggering sum came from an extensive underground network of speakeasies, breweries, and distribution routes running throughout the entire city. Authorities struggled for years to even estimate the true scale of his operation, given how deeply hidden and protected it remained. Despite the massive wealth generated, it was ultimately unpaid taxes rather than bootlegging itself that finally brought his empire crashing down. One man's illegal fortune quietly rewrote the entire story of American organized crime. So there you have it, 71 wildly dumb, chaotic, and unforgettable pieces of Chicago history. Which one shocked you the most? Drop it in the comments right now because I actually read every single one. If this video made you laugh, shake your head, or say no, way out loud, hit subscribe to Dumbest Things so you never miss the next deep dive. Chicago is weird, America is weird, and we are just getting started. See you in the next one.